Hi everyone, my name is Michael and I'm from the library at the University of Newcastle. In this video, I'm going to talk about secondary sources of law. So what quality secondary sources are out there that you can be using in your assessments, and how do you know that they are quality? So firstly, some quick definitions. Primary sources are the law. They're your cases and your legislation, whereas secondary sources are sources that describe or provide commentary on those primary sources. So they might explain or analyse or critique the law. Using quality secondary sources can be really beneficial at many different stages in the legal research process. So when you're starting your research, secondary sources are great for gathering background information and understanding a general area of law or a legal issue. And at this stage, secondary sources can point to key legislation and case law about a certain topic. Once you're getting further into your research, secondary sources can give you that more in-depth analysis, explaining and critiquing different areas of cases and legislation. So the first secondary source that might come to mind is the peer-reviewed journal, a really common secondary source that we're all familiar with. And they're a great source of quality legal information, but there is more to secondary sources than just journal articles. And I'm going to highlight a few of these different types of secondary sources. And there is more information and links to these sources on the Secondary Sources of Law Subject Resource Guide that you can access through the University of Newcastle Library. A great starting point for legal research is your class textbook. And legal textbooks more broadly. Textbooks are great for that overview of a topic area, and they can lead you to primary sources of law as well. Other secondary sources that can be useful at the beginning of the research process are legal dictionaries and encyclopedias. Dictionaries define legal terms and can help you identify other relevant terms that you'll be able to use in your searching. And encyclopedias can give that more overview of legal principles and will generally point to key primary sources. Links to key legal dictionaries and encyclopedias, such as the Australian Law Dictionary, Laws of Australia, and Halsbury's Laws of Australia, can be found on the Secondary Sources Subject Resource Guide as well. So the next secondary source that we're going to look at is legal commentary. And this used to be called loose leaf services back when they were on paper, but now we're accessing them mainly electronically. So they're subject-specific legal commentaries that provide up-to-date information on those specialised areas of law. Commentaries are regularly updated and they're published for professional practitioners. So they're great for getting that professional or how the law is applied type of information. And these can be found on publisher databases, and we have them marked out in our subject resource guide. The next secondary source is Law Reform Commission reports. And these are such a handy resource. If you can find a Law Reform Commission report on the area that you're looking at, it can be so useful for your research and for using as a source in your assignment writing. So law reform commissions publish reports that examine law reform proposals, including looking at the relevant case law, legislation, and secondary sources. Reports will tend to look at the current state of the law, but also give some historical context as well. And these reports are put together by expert researchers, so they're very reliable and in-depth in their sort of information, so they can be extremely useful and valuable sources of information. There are lots of links to reports from agencies such as the Australian Law Reform Commission and the New South Wales Law Reform Commission on the Library Subject Resource Guide. The final resource that I'm going to mention here are parliamentary papers. These are also known as extrinsic materials, and they are secondary sources that can help to understand and interpret legislation. So the Subject Resource Guide has links to sites where these can be found, such as the Parliament of New South Wales website. So included in this suite of resources under the banner Parliamentary Papers, you'll find things such as explanatory memoranda. Explanatory memoranda are sometimes called explanatory notes, and they really give you that simple, easy to understand, plain English version of the legislation. So now we've looked at a few different types of secondary sources, we need to think about how we know whether they are quality resources that we can be using for our assessments. So I'm going to talk about a particular method of evaluating information called the TRAAPS test. And this is a method of assessing quality of resources to see if they can be used in your assessments. It's a common method of resource evaluation, but there are some sort of specific things that we need to keep in mind when we're looking at secondary sources of law. So firstly, TRAAPS stands for Timeliness, Relevance, Authority, Accuracy, and Purpose. So these are the 5 criteria that we're going to be looking at the sources with. So firstly, currency considers if the information is up to date. So this is called currency or timeliness, and we're looking at when the information was published. For secondary sources, it's important to consider if it is discussing an area of law which is still considered good law, or is it looking at legislation that might have been amended. So even though we're not looking at the primary sources, we need to make sure that the commentary that we're using is considering the primary sources that are current. The next criteria is relevance. So we want to know, is the information related to your topic? Is the commentary about cases or legislation that are relevant to the legal issues that you need to address? So it's making sure that it's on topic. Is the information relevant in terms of jurisdiction? So that is also something that we need to really pay attention to with secondary sources. And sort of separately, is the information at an appropriate academic level? Is it aimed at academic writing? We need to make sure that it's relevant for what we're going to use it for. The next criteria is authority. So we're thinking about things like who wrote it? Are they academics? Are they experts? Who published it? Are these people trustworthy as sources of information? If it's a journal article, we want to think about whether it's been peer-reviewed. And to see if it's peer-reviewed, we can look for things like references, making sure that it's referencing other authoritative sources of information. And for things like web pages, we're also checking the domain, making sure we're getting things that are from places like .gov rather than .com. If you are accessing something from one of the big publisher databases, it is a good sign that it is authoritative and peer-reviewed if it's a journal article, but you still will need to evaluate each source as you're using it. The next criteria is accuracy. So finding multiple authoritative sources that provide the same information or point of view is a good way to ascertain the accuracy of a source. Is the information backed up by other sources? Are there references that you can check? And does it read like an opinion or fact? And the final criteria is purpose. Why was the information published? Is it biased? Does the author have a motive other than providing facts? So there might be commercial interests at play. We're looking for academic and informative information. So now we've looked at a few different types of secondary sources and also how to evaluate them when you're thinking about using them for your assessments. And I hope that when you are doing your legal research and writing assignments, that you start to think outside the box a little bit. Try and think of other types of secondary sources that may be able to support your arguments, or you might be able to use for gathering a bit more background information. And look outside the journal articles. There are more things out there, and they can be really helpful for your legal research. So, good luck with your assessments.